Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little less philosophical, but no less fascinating. The food served in Wild West saloons. Sure, they were known for whiskey, bar fights, and questionable piano music, but what did people actually eat there? Was it all beans and bacon? Or were there surprises hiding behind those swinging doors? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that hit you when you walked into a Wild West saloon wasn't the piano music or the sound of someone losing a week's wages at cards. It was the smell. Forget the romanticized scent of sizzling steak and fresh cornbread. The real bouquet was more like a punch in the nostrils, a complex blend of sweaty cowboys, wet tobacco, old beer, damp wood, horses that hadn't bathed in a decade, and, if you were lucky, the faintest hint of something cooking in the back. Some saloons tried to mask it with sawdust on the floor, or pipe smoke thick enough to cause temporary memory loss. Others just embraced it. "You don't come here for the air," barkeeps would say, slapping flies off the counter with a rag that hadn't been cleaned since the Civil War. And yet, somehow, there was always a kitchen. It might have been a hole-in-the-wall fire pit with a pan of beans bubbling over embers. It might have been a grumpy woman in a soot-covered apron stirring mystery stew with a spoon that doubled as a self-defense weapon. But food was being made, somewhere, and if you could smell it through the sweat and the whiskey vapour, you were halfway to dinner. That is, if you could find a seat. Most saloons weren't laid out like modern restaurants. There were no servers, no menus with scripted fonts, just a few splintered tables, some rickety chairs, and one long counter where you could eat, drink, argue, or all three in rapid succession. If you were a regular, the cook might shout something like, "beans or stew," and you shouted back your choice without looking up. If you were new in town, they'd stare you down, trying to guess whether you were going to pay or pass out before the plate hit the table. And that's what made saloon dining so special. It wasn't about taste. It was about survival. You ate what they had, not what you wanted. You sat next to strangers who might rob you or save your life tomorrow. And if the food made you sick, well, that's what whiskey was for. In the hierarchy of Wild West cuisine, beans sat squarely at the top, not because they were delicious, but because they were cheap, indestructible, and could survive an apocalypse, a gunfight, and a stampede without breaking a sweat. Pinto beans, black beans, navy beans, it didn't matter. If it was dry, vaguely edible, and could be boiled into submission, it ended up in the pot. Beans were the unsung heroes of saloon kitchens, served morning, noon, and night, often to men who hadn't seen a vegetable since they left Kansas. Preparation was simple. Step 1. Pour beans into a pot. Step 2. Boil them for 6 hours over a questionable fire. Step 3. Serve them with salt pork, a stale biscuit, and a look of mild apology. Some cooks tried to get fancy, adding lard, onions, or even chili powder if they were feeling ambitious. But most didn't bother. In the Wild West, flavour was considered a luxury, and seasoning was whatever blew in from the open window. Beans were hearty, filling, and predictable, 3 traits that cowboys respected more than gold. They fueled long cattle drives, powered poker nights, and gave you something to chew on while you waited for the piano player to start again, or for someone to get tossed through the front window. The only downside? Aftermath. 1 cowboy eating beans was tolerable. 10 cowboys in a saloon full of beans was a biological weapon. It's said that some bar fights weren't started by insults, but by a single silent but deadly betrayal near the stove. Still, beans were dependable. When the meat ran out, when the chickens fled, and when the cook had exactly 7 brain cells left from the whiskey fumes, the beans remained. Unbothered, unburnt, unchanged. Some cowboys even preferred them. They could be eaten cold, reheated endlessly, and used as makeshift currency in emergencies. Legend has it a man once bought a horse with 3 pounds of salted beans and a promise never to return. So yes, saloon food had its highs and lows, but beans were the baseline, the bedrock, the humble heartbeat of 1,000 dusty meals. You didn't love them, you respected them, and sometimes that was enough. If beans were the soul of Wild West saloon cuisine, salt pork was its slightly greasier backbone, a slab of fat and meat so tough it could survive a thunderstorm, a bar brawl, and 6 months in a saddlebag without changing texture. Salt pork wasn't bacon, though cowboys loved to pretend it was. It was pork belly, heavily salted and often smoked, preserved in barrels with enough brine to season a small ocean. The salt kept it from rotting, and also, arguably, from being edible. Cooked right, salt pork was tolerable. Fried up in a hot skillet, served crispy and sizzling, it had flavour, grease, and that satisfying crunch that made you briefly forget the rest of your dinner came from a can. But cooked wrong, which happened often, it was like chewing a salted boot heel dipped in axle grease. Still, salt pork had its fans. It was easy to transport, hard to ruin, though many tried, and gave even the blandest pot of beans a salty punch of joy, or at least a reason to drink more whiskey. Cooks in saloons didn't waste a single bit. The fat used to fry everything from potatoes to biscuits. The rinds, tossed into stews or given to dogs, or to unlucky newcomers who didn't know the difference. One bite, and they'd learn real quick that the barkeep wasn't joking when he said, "Chew slow or choke proud." And yes, sometimes the pork was suspicious. A greenish tinge here, a questionable smell there. But in saloons, the motto wasn't, "Is it fresh?" It was more like, "Did it kill the last guy?" If not, you gave it a try. Salt pork was versatile too. It could be diced into beans, slapped on biscuits, fried alone, or gnawed at like jerky on long rides. Cowboys packed it like treasure, and saloon cooks leaned on it when the chickens ran off or the stew pot got too thin. It wasn't elegant, and it sure wasn't healthy. But in a world where you might ride 60 miles before your next hot meal, salt pork got the job done. And if you survived it, well, you were stronger for it. In the Wild West, stew was the great culinary equalizer, hot, vaguely meaty, and deeply suspicious. It was the one thing almost every saloon served, no matter how ramshackle the kitchen. Why? Because stew was the perfect cover story for whatever odds and ends the cook had lying around, or couldn't legally describe. The base was simple, a pot, a fire, and ambition. You started with water, maybe some beans or potatoes, and then you tossed in whatever hadn't walked away yet. Beef? Sure. Rabbit? Definitely. Squirrel? Yep. Rattlesnake? If it wasn't biting anymore, toss it in. One traveller once claimed he found a boot string in his bowl. He wasn't even mad. It was the most chewable part. Meat quality varied wildly. Some stews had tender chunks of beef from the local butcher. Others, well, they had meat, the kind you didn't ask about. If the cook looked nervous and the dog population had recently decreased, you just ate around the chewy bits and prayed. Vegetables, when available, were usually boiled into oblivion. Carrots became orange smudges. Onions disappeared completely. Potatoes held on the longest, but eventually surrendered. The result? A bubbling brown-grey slurry that smelled way better than it looked and tasted better than you'd expect, assuming enough salt. Spices were a luxury. Most stew got its kick from whatever was on the cook's hands or knife. If you got black pepper, you were in a fancy place. If you got chili powder, congratulations. Your sinuses were about to be cleared by force. But despite the mystery, stew was comfort food for the weary cowboy. It was hot, it was filling, and it could be stretched endlessly by just adding water. One pot might feed a dozen men, or be reheated 3 days in a row until it developed the consistency and personality of old glue. You didn't eat stew because it was delicious. You ate it because it was there, because it was warm, and because nothing else in town was edible, unless you liked chewing tobacco and regret. Just remember, never ask what's in it. Because in the Wild West, ignorance wasn't just bliss, it was dinner. Not every cowboy could afford a steak, but nearly every saloon had something bread-like to soak up the stew. That something usually came in one of two forms: soft, flaky biscuits that were heavenly when fresh, or hardtack, which was basically bread's undead cousin. Let's start with the biscuits. When done right, which was rare but magical, they were warm, buttery, and flaky enough to convince a man he'd stumbled into a proper kitchen. Cooks who could make good biscuits were local legends. Some claimed their secret was lard, others swore by buttermilk. A few probably just had lucky hands and low standards. These biscuits were best served alongside beans or stew, used to mop up whatever broth hadn't burned your tongue. They were often made in cast-iron pans, baked over open flames, and served with a suspicious chunk of butter or a splash of molasses if the place was fancy. And then there was hardtack, a slab of flour and water, baked until it could survive nuclear winter. Originally made for soldiers and sailors, it found its way west thanks to one simple fact: it never went bad. It also barely qualified as food. Eating hardtack required strategy. First, you'd inspect it for weevils, which wasn't a deal-breaker, just an added crunch. Then, you'd soak it in stew, coffee, or whiskey until it softened. This could take anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 presidential terms. Even after soaking, chewing hardtack was a commitment. You didn't just eat it, you grappled with it. Dentists probably made good money off cowboys who challenged a piece and lost. But here's the thing. Both biscuits and hardtack served their purpose. They were cheap. They were portable. They filled you up. And in a world where calories mattered more than cuisine, that was enough. So if you strolled into a dusty saloon and saw a plate of steaming biscuits, you counted your blessings. If they handed you a hardtack puck the size of your palm, well, at least it came with a story, and maybe a chipped tooth. If you think modern coffee is strong, try cowboy coffee. A brew so potent it didn't just wake you up, it stared back and dared you to blink. Coffee in the Wild West was less about taste and more about survival. It wasn't roasted by origin, filtered through fancy gadgets, or topped with oat milk foam art. It was ground roughly, or not at all, dumped into a kettle, and boiled until the liquid turned black and sentient. The standard recipe went like this. Take water from whatever source you had, hopefully not downstream from the horses. Throw in a handful of coffee grounds, measured by instinct and aggression. Boil it. Hard. Don't strain it. Don't question it. Just pour and pray. The result? A thick, dark concoction that smelled like burnt dreams and tasted like vengeance. It wasn't uncommon for the last sip to contain more grounds than liquid, which meant cowboys got both caffeine and fibre in one heroic gulp. And yet, they loved it. Coffee kept you warm on cold desert mornings. It kept you awake through night watches. It masked hangovers and helped digest questionable stew. It was fuel, comfort, and punishment, all in one tin cup. Saloons didn't always serve coffee unless they had a kitchen, but if they did, it came out boiling hot, probably old, and strong enough to strip paint. One cowboy described it as like drinking a kick from a mule, but you miss it when it's gone. Fancy folk might have added sugar or canned milk if available. Everyone else just grimaced and powered through. And if a saloon had been reheating the same pot all day, you'd get the boldest brew known to man, thick as tar and twice as resentful. It's worth noting that some cooks reused old grounds to stretch the pot. This economy method led to coffee that tasted like disappointment and regret, but it still counted. Because in the Wild West, you didn't drink coffee for pleasure. You drank it to feel alive, and stay that way. In the Wild West, meat wasn't just food, it was currency, status, and occasionally a test of bravery. If you could afford it, you might walk into a saloon and order a steak. What you got depended entirely on luck, timing, and whether the cook held a personal grudge against your face. Steak, in theory, was a luxury. In reality, it was often a tough, overcooked slab of beef that had been fried in a pan with lard, scorched into obedience, and served with exactly zero garnish. If you asked for it medium rare, the cook would just stare at you until your moustache wilted. When fresh beef wasn't available, and let's be honest, it usually wasn't, saloons turned to other options: dried jerky, salted buffalo, occasionally venison, or even wild boar, if someone had gotten lucky on a hunt. And by lucky, we mean managed to hit it and drag it back before the buzzards did. In mining towns or far-flung settlements, meat got more creative: squirrel stew, rattlesnake roast jackrabbit with seasoning. If it had legs and didn't belong to a customer's horse, it was fair game. Sometimes you were served meat, and no one told you what it was. That was a sign to eat quietly and not ask questions. If you chewed too long or found something resembling a whisker, you just sipped your whiskey, nodded solemnly, and accepted your fate. There was also the risk of age. Some meats had been hanging around long enough to earn names. Cooks would slice off the bad parts, drown the rest in gravy, and tell you it was well aged. If your plate twitched when you poked it, you were entitled to one raised eyebrow and nothing more. Still, when the meat was fresh and the cook wasn't drunk, you might get a real meal. A sizzling slab of beef, a fried egg on top, and maybe a biscuit on the side. A plate that reminded you why people survived gunfights, for this. But most of the time, you ate what was there, and hoped it didn't eat you back. In a Wild West saloon, dessert wasn't really a category. It was more of a happy accident, the result of a cook with spare ingredients and a tiny sliver of mercy. But if there was one reliable sweetish comfort, it was cornbread, made from simple cornmeal, water or milk, lard, and sometimes a dash of baking powder, if the cook remembered. Cornbread was the Swiss Army knife of the frontier menu. It could be baked in pans, fried in skillets, or even dropped by spoonfuls into boiling stew if someone was in a hurry, or lazy. Alone, cornbread was dry, crumbly, slightly sweet, depending on who made it, and always best served fresh, which meant it was almost never fresh. More often, you'd get a wedge that had been sitting near the stove since sunrise, hardened like a miner's conscience. But here's where the magic happened. Molasses. A dark, sticky, syrupy miracle that turned dry cornbread into something just shy of glorious. It was the cowboy's frosting, the outlaw's drizzle, the lonely gambler's last bit of joy before losing everything on a bad hand. Molasses was affordable, kept well in the heat, and masked the sins of even the driest baked goods. If a saloon had a barrel of it, you were in luck. If they warmed it before serving, you were practically eating at a 5-star establishment by frontier standards. Some cooks went a step further, pouring molasses over skillet-fried cornbread and tossing in a pinch of salt or spice. It wasn't quite cake, but it felt like it if you'd been chewing jerky and hardtack all week. Cornbread with molasses became the default dessert. Quick, cheap, filling, and sweet enough to calm your nerves after a rough ride or a close call in the poker room. No icing, no whipped cream, no frills, just grit, grain, and gooey satisfaction. And for many, it was more than enough. Because when your life involved cattle drives, dust storms, and the occasional shootout, dessert didn't need to sparkle. It just needed to remind you that not everything in the West was trying to kill you. If you were lucky enough to stumble into a saloon before noon, preferably sober and not bleeding, you might have been offered eggs and chicken. And if so, you were in the presence of a miracle. Or a trap. Let's start with the eggs. Fresh eggs in the Wild West were gold. Not actual gold, but nearly as rare and equally fragile. Chickens weren't raised for fun. They were cranky, prone to wandering, and occasionally stolen, eaten, or lost to foxes. If a saloon had eggs on hand, they either had their own chickens, a local supplier, or a secret smuggling operation from the next town over. What kind of eggs were they? Hopefully chicken, possibly duck, maybe something else. You learned not to ask. You ordered eggs, and what you got depended entirely on the cook's mood and the egg's age. Some were scrambled to disguise colour, others were fried until the yolks turned to leather. And if it wobbled when it hit your plate, that was a sign from the universe to order whiskey instead. As for chicken, it was on the menu, but not often. If it said fried chicken, what you'd probably get was a scrawny bird that died angry. Tough, bony, and fried in lard until the flavour tapped out, chicken wasn't always worth the chewing. But it was meat, it was hot, and it wasn't beans again, so folks ate it gratefully. You might get a drumstick the size of your thumb, or a whole quarter roasted on an open flame. You might also get a feather in your gravy, and that was just part of the charm. Breakfast offerings of eggs and chicken were a status symbol for saloons. They said, "We have food that didn't come from a can or a barrel." If the eggs were warm and the chicken wasn't dry, you'd tell your buddies for weeks. And if it gave you food poisoning, well, that was just the West reminding you who was in charge. Still, there was something hopeful about ordering eggs. They meant morning, they meant survival, and just maybe, they meant you'd live to drink again by nightfall. In a Wild West saloon, pie was more than just dessert. It was a statement. If you saw a pie sitting on the bar, steam rising, crust golden, scent of apples wafting through the smoke and whiskey, you knew this saloon meant business. You also knew that someone in the kitchen had put in real effort, which was practically a love letter in a land of bean slop and overcooked pork. Now, don't get ahead of yourself. Pie in the Wild West wasn't a perfect lattice-topped pastry with farm-fresh fruit. It was a rough, rustic affair, uneven crusts, fillings made from canned or dried fruit, and usually served lukewarm at best. Whipped cream, not unless a cow followed you into town. The most common varieties were apple, peach, or berry. Berry being a flexible category that sometimes included raisins or things that only vaguely resembled berries. If the cook had a sweet tooth, you might get a dash of cinnamon. If not, you got crust, sugar, and optimism. Still, pie was a rare treat. Most cowboys hadn't seen one since they left home, and saloons knew that offering pie gave them a competitive edge. A good slice could pull customers from 2 towns over, and if the pie was warm and flaky, you better believe someone would threaten to shoot over the last piece. There are recorded stories, and a few exaggerated legends, of poker games that ended in gunfire over dessert disputes. You took the last slice was as valid an offence as cheating at cards. In a world where men had been stabbed over spilled whiskey, pie was practically sacred. Of course, not all pies were created equal. Some were mostly crust, some were experimental. Some had fillings that hinted at being fruit once, in a previous life. But if the stars aligned, the cook was sober, the oven was hot, and the fruit wasn't fermenting, then that pie was something to remember. Because in the dust and grit of the frontier, a slice of pie wasn't just food, it was hope served on a tin plate. Cheese in the Wild West was a lot like a poker game, full of risk, a little bluffing, and a strong chance you'd regret your choices the next morning. It did exist, yes, but only if you knew where to look, and even then, you had to be brave. Because cheese wasn't shipped in tidy wheels wrapped in wax paper. It was made locally, often by someone who once read about dairy fermentation while drunk. Most saloon cheese came in 2 varieties, hard, yellow, and suspiciously sweaty, or soft, crumbly, and slightly aggressive to the nose. Refrigeration, that was a luxury. So unless it was a particularly cold month or the saloon was near a cave, chances are your cheese had developed a personality. It might be cheddar. It might be something vaguely Swiss. It might be a lump of dairy guesswork with salt on top. And if it squeaked when you bit into it, well, that was between you and your jaw. Cheese was usually served in chunks alongside bread, jerky, or if you were lucky, a pickle. It helped balance out the saltiness of everything else, and gave cowboys a protein boost between brawls. You could even melt it over beans or toast it on cornbread, assuming the cook was feeling artistic. But beware, some saloons cut corners. Cheese might be old butter gone wrong, or curdled milk pressed into a bar shape and rolled in pepper to distract you. One travelling merchant once said he bought cheese in Nevada that tasted like boiled sock with a rind. He still ate the whole thing, because even bad cheese was still cheese. And in the Wild West, a saloon that offered any cheese at all stood out. It meant the owner had connections to a local farm, or at least access to a cow that hadn't been rustled yet. Offering cheese wasn't about flavour, it was a flex, a symbol of civilization in a place where most people still bathed with sand. So if a saloon plate came with a slice of cheese, you'd eye it, sniff it, tap it with your fork, and then eat it anyway. Because in the West, a gamble was just part of dinner. If it could be soaked in vinegar and forgotten in a jar, chances are it was served in a Wild West saloon. Pickling wasn't just a flavour choice, it was a survival strategy. Before refrigeration, saloon kitchens relied on brine and sourness to keep food from crawling off the shelf. Vegetables, eggs, fruit, even meat. Nothing was safe from the preserving power of vinegar. And that's how we got pickled everything. Pickled cucumbers? The classic. Crunchy, sharp, and occasionally green. They were served as sides, chasers for whiskey, or just something to chew on between bad decisions. If you were lucky, they were made fresh with garlic and spice. If not, they tasted like regret and rainwater. Pickled eggs? A saloon staple. You'd see them floating in cloudy jars behind the bar, usually near the whiskey. They looked like ghostly eyeballs and had the texture of sadness. Some cowboys swore by them. A quick shot of protein, easy to store, and they mostly stayed down. Others swore at them. Pickled onions? Common in mining towns, sharp, tangy, and strong enough to chase off unwanted conversation. One bite, and you could talk downwind of a stampede. Even pickled peaches or pears might make an appearance. When dried fruit was soaked in sweet brine to create a dish both confusing and strangely addictive. It wasn't dessert, it wasn't dinner, it was just wet, vinegary optimism. The beauty of pickled goods was their shelf life. A saloon could keep jars around for months, sometimes years, without worrying about spoilage. And in a place where meat went bad faster than a poker hand, that was invaluable. But let's be honest, not all pickled items were created equal. Sometimes the jars weren't sealed right. Sometimes the cook experimented. And sometimes the pickled thing stared back at you. There are tales, possibly exaggerated, of men biting into pickled sausages only to find bones. Or a label that simply read, maybe pork. Still, pickled foods were part of the Wild West experience. Salty, sour, and strangely satisfying. Like everything else that lasted out there. You didn't eat them for pleasure. You ate them because they wouldn't kill you. Probably. When food was scarce, the kitchen was closed, or the stew looked like it still had a pulse. Cowboys and drifters alike turned to the most dependable item on the saloon menu. Whiskey. It was always available. It required no preparation. And if you drank enough of it, you forgot you were hungry. Or that you'd just eaten a bowl of squirrel mystery meat. Whiskey in the Wild West wasn't aged in oak barrels or curated by connoisseurs. It was rough, raw, and often dangerous. Made from corn, rye, or whatever the barkeep had lying around, it was distilled in backrooms, barns, and bathtubs. The result was a beverage that could clean wounds, strip paint, and fuel a fistfight. Some called it rot gut, others chain lightning, and a few simply referred to it as lunch. When beans were burnt and bread was mouldy, men drank their calories, one burning shot at a time. Saloon whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was a survival tool. It helped numb the pain of trail dust, heartbreak, broken ribs, and highly questionable stew. One shot before a duel, 2 shots after, and maybe 3 more while you waited to see if your bullet wound was serious. It was common for saloons to serve whiskey specials, which came with a side of beans or a biscuit, not for flavour, but to keep you upright. Some men ordered whiskey with a pickled egg floating in it, which somehow counted as both hydration and protein. And of course, whiskey was social glue. You bought it to make friends, to start fights, and occasionally to apologise after both. You could measure a saloon's reputation by how fast its whiskey knocked a man off his stool. Quality? Don't ask. Some whiskey was barely more than coloured moonshine. Additives ranged from tobacco juice to cayenne pepper. It burned going down, and if it didn't, you were probably drinking kerosene. Still, no one complained, because whiskey was warm, cheap, and honest, the only thing on the menu that never lied about what it was. And on nights when your meal came in a glass, with no fork and no judgment, you raised it high, and called it dinner. In any Wild West saloon that dared serve food, there existed a shadowy, smoke-covered figure whose power rivaled that of the bartender, the sheriff, and the town preacher combined: the cook. This individual, often unshaven, always irritable, was either a life-saving genius or a culinary war criminal. There was no middle ground. You'd never see them smile, but you'd remember their cooking for days, either in gratitude or gastrointestinal trauma. Saloon cooks weren't trained chefs. They were usually ex-miners, ex-cons, or ex-somethings who knew how to build a fire and weren't afraid of questionable meat. Their kitchen. A fire pit, a dented stove, and a single cast-iron pan that hadn't been washed since the gold rush. And yet, somehow, they fed entire saloons. On a good day, they'd whip up a pot of chili that could bring a man to tears. In a good way. The biscuits would be warm, the beans cooked through, and the cornbread just sweet enough to remind you of home. But on a bad day, the beans were scorched, the meat was grey, and the stew had an unsettling layer of oil that moved when the pot was still. You didn't complain. You couldn't. Saloon etiquette was clear. Never insult the cook. Because the cook controlled everything. The salt, the grease, the mystery meat ratio. If they liked you, you got the freshest cut. If not, you got the spoon scrapings from last night's disaster, reheated into chilly surprise. They also doubled as the saloon's unofficial bouncer. No one wanted to get hit by a ladle that had just survived frying salt pork. And if the cook had a cleaver, which many did, they could clear a room faster than a shotgun. Despite their moods, these cooks were vital. They kept cowboys on their feet, miners from passing out, and travellers from collapsing mid-sentence. They worked long hours in heat and smoke, took insults as seasoning, and lived by a single rule. If you don't like it, there's the door, or the whiskey. So whether they were your saviour or your saboteur, you always nodded respectfully to the cook. Because in the Wild West, they held your stomach, and your fate, in their greasy, glorious hands. Now that we've walked through the swinging doors, sniffed the stew, and stared down a pickled egg in a foggy jar, the real question remains: would you actually eat the food served at a Wild West saloon? Let's be honest, modern taste buds might not survive the experience. The beans were basic, the meat was a gamble, and the stew was more mystery than meal. You'd need strong teeth, a stronger stomach, and the kind of appetite that comes from riding 40 miles on a sunburned horse with nothing but dust in your lungs. But here's the thing. For the cowboys, miners, gamblers, and misfits of the American frontier, saloon food wasn't about gourmet flavour or Instagram-worthy plating. It was about fuel, calories, heat, a warm plate between gunfights, train robberies, or another night sleeping in a barn next to a mule named Regret. It was about survival. You didn't ask where the meat came from. You didn't complain if the biscuit crumbled like chalk. You just sat down, ate what was handed to you, and washed it down with something strong enough to kill bacteria, or at least make you stop caring about it. And when food was good? When the beans were fresh, the coffee didn't bite back, and the cook had spared a little molasses for the cornbread. It felt like a miracle. So would you eat it? If you lived back then? Yes. You wouldn't just eat it, you'd be thankful for it. You'd scrape the bowl, wipe the plate with your crust of bread, and order seconds with coins that still smelled like dynamite and horse sweat. You'd laugh with strangers, curse the cook, toast with whiskey, and maybe, just maybe, end the night with a slice of pie and a story worth telling. Because saloon food wasn't glamorous. It was gritty, greasy and real. And in a world where the West was still wild, that was enough. Long before tattoos were scrawled across biceps and backs in trendy shops with buzzing needles, they were something far older, etched not with fashion in mind, but with mystery, meaning, and survival. Let's rewind to a time when cities didn't exist, when gods hadn't yet been given names, and humans lived close to the bone, in both spirit and skin. Enter Ötzi the Iceman. Discovered in 1991, frozen in a glacier between Austria and Italy, his mummified body was over 5,000 years old, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. And yet, across his leathery skin, researchers found something incredibly modern: tattoos. 61 of them, to be precise. They weren't ornamental spirals or stylized animals. They were dark carbon marks, dots and lines running down his spine, behind his knees and around his ankles. Here's where it gets wild. The locations of Ötzi's tattoos matched known acupuncture points. Was this a primitive form of pain management? An ancient healing technique? Or something more spiritual? A rite of endurance carved directly into the flesh? We'll never know for certain. But one thing is clear. Even in the Stone Age, humans were already marking their bodies with purpose. And Ötzi wasn't alone. In ancient Egypt, tattoos appeared predominantly on women, including priestesses and dancers. These weren't decorative butterflies or names of lost lovers, but rather symbolic patterns, often placed around the abdomen, thighs, and chest. Some scholars believe these tattoos were intended to offer protection during childbirth, to channel fertility, or to ward off evil spirits, like spiritual armor drawn right onto the body. Even in Nubia, south of Egypt, archaeologists unearthed mummies with animal figures tattooed on their limbs: bulls, crocodiles, symbols of power and survival. Across these early societies, tattoos weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of reverence, resilience, and ritual. They carried meaning, not in ink alone, but in pain, permanence, and belief. So next time you see someone's sleeve of ink at the gym or on the subway, remember, they're carrying on a tradition that started not in a studio, but in the ice, in the sand, and in the sacred silence of forgotten millennia. If you ever thought tattoos were just edgy accessories or signs of rebellion, try saying that in front of a Polynesian chief and watch the room go quiet. In Polynesian cultures, tattoos weren't optional or decorative. They were sacred. In fact, the word tattoo itself comes from the Tahitian word tatau, meaning to strike. And that's exactly how it began. With bone tools dipped in soot, rhythmically tapped into the skin with a stick, each strike echoing centuries of tradition. In places like Samoa, Tonga, and especially among the Maori of New Zealand, tattoos weren't just art. They were identity. A person's moko, the intricate facial tattoos of the Maori, could tell you everything you needed to know: their rank, their family, their ancestry, even their personal achievements. The face wasn't just a canvas, it was a living resume, and removing it would be like erasing a man's entire life. Young men would often receive their first tattoos during painful, ceremonial rites of passage. This wasn't a Friday night decision after a few drinks. It was a spiritual transformation. The process was excruciating. No anesthetics, no numbing creams, just raw courage and a communal belief in the deeper purpose of the pain. Women too were tattooed, often on the lips, chin or thighs, symbols of beauty, maturity, and mana, the sacred power believed to flow through all living things. A woman without tattoos could be considered incomplete, a canvas left blank in a world full of stories. But colonialism, as it often does, tried to erase it all. Missionaries arrived with scissors, soap, and shame. They saw the tattoos as primitive, pagan, and unchristian. In some areas, traditional tattooing was outlawed, forcing it underground, like a sacred language spoken only in whispers. Still, the ink endured. Today, Many Polynesians are reclaiming their tattoo heritage with pride. The ancient tools have returned, the designs have resurfaced, and across the Pacific you can hear the sound of tattoo once again, not just as an art form, but as an act of cultural survival. These weren't just marks on the skin. They were, and still are, declarations of spirit, blood, and belonging. Step into the world of togas, gladiators, and philosophers, and you might not expect to find tattoos. After all, when we think of ancient Greece and Rome, we imagine marble statues and clean, idealized bodies. But peel back the myth, and you'll find ink lurking in the shadows. In ancient Greece, tattoos were originally associated with slaves and criminals. In fact, the Greek word stigma, yes, the root of our modern term stigmatize, referred to the permanent marks branded or inked into someone's skin as punishment. These weren't symbolic or decorative. They were labels, warnings. If you were a runaway slave or a captured enemy, your captor might tattoo your forehead with a message like, "Stop me, I ran away," a permanent scarlet letter etched into the skin. The Romans, pragmatic as ever, borrowed this idea and took it further. Soldiers in the Roman army, especially those in specialized legions, were often tattooed to mark their loyalty, a kind of flesh-bound dog tag. But they also used tattoos to brand gladiators, slaves, and prisoners of war. It wasn't about identity, it was about ownership. There's a darker twist here. The early Christians, persecuted by Roman authorities, were sometimes tattooed as a form of humiliation, but centuries later, Christians would reclaim the practice. Pilgrims to Jerusalem in the Middle Ages often returned with small crosses tattooed on their arms, proof of their devotion and suffering. What began as a tool of punishment morphed into a badge of faith. Interestingly, in later Roman times, Emperor Constantine, the same ruler who legalized Christianity, banned tattooing on the face. Not because it was cruel, but because the face, he declared, was made in God's image and shouldn't be defiled. The irony? Bodies were still fair game. Unlike in Polynesia, where tattoos elevated someone's social standing, in the Greco-Roman world, they often lowered it. Tattoos marked you as an outsider, a sinner, a slave. But they also told a story. Not always one you wanted, but one you carried forever. In these empires of law, conquest, and spectacle, tattoos weren't about self-expression. They were branding, sometimes literally, tools of control, punishment, and power. And like all marks of oppression, they would eventually be reclaimed. While the West branded its slaves and criminals, the East took a more spiritual, symbolic approach to body art, where tattoos could be both sacred protection and social paradox. Let's begin in India. Though India is more famous for Mendi, the temporary henna art applied during weddings and festivals, the country also has a long history of permanent tattoos. Among tribal communities like the Baiga, Gondi and Santhal, tattoos were considered both ornamental and protective. A woman might be tattooed with symbols of fertility, strength, or religious devotion. Not on a whim, but as part of a deeply rooted tradition passed from grandmother to granddaughter. These tattoos weren't just for beauty. They were seen as jewelry for the soul, something no thief could steal and no poverty could take away. Meanwhile, in Japan, the story was more complicated. In the early days, during the Jomon period, tattoos might have had spiritual significance, possibly used to mark status or ward off evil spirits. But by the time Japan entered its more structured eras, particularly during the Edo period, tattooing took on a whole new life. First, it became punishment. Criminals were tattooed on the face or arm with marks indicating their crime and region, permanently branding them as untrustworthy. Imagine walking into a village and everyone instantly knowing your sins just by reading your skin. But then something fascinating happened. A counterculture emerged. Outcasts, including firemen, labourers, and later members of the Yakuza, adopted tattoos not as shame, but as honour. They created elaborate full-body designs called irizumi, often depicting dragons, tigers, and mythological figures. These were masterpieces, carved into the flesh over hundreds of painful hours. Each design told a story, a personal legend inked beneath society's judgment. At the same time, Buddhist pilgrims in Southeast Asia developed Sakyant tattoos, geometric designs and Pali scriptures believed to offer protection, strength, and spiritual blessings. These were administered by monks using sharpened bamboo or steel rods, and always accompanied by chants and prayer. In the East, tattoos could be holy or taboo, sacred or criminal. It all depended on who wore them and why. But one thing was certain. In these cultures, skin was never silent. It spoke of power, punishment, prayer, and pride. As the Roman Empire gave way to the rise of Christianity, the tattoo needle, once a symbol of identity or punishment, began to vanish from the Western world. Why? Because in the eyes of the Church, the body was no longer just flesh. It was a temple. And temples apparently weren't meant to be scribbled on. The early Christians had a complex relationship with tattoos. On one hand, some groups adopted tattoos as declarations of faith. Pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem would have small crosses tattooed on their wrists to signify their devotion, a permanent spiritual passport. These were symbols of endurance and survival, proof they had made the sacred journey and lived to tell the tale. But that was the exception, not the rule. By the early Middle Ages, the dominant message coming from religious authorities was clear. Marking the body was a pagan practice, and pagan meant sinful. The Bible, specifically Leviticus 19:28, was often cited, "You shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks upon you. I am the Lord." That single line was enough to bury an entire art form across much of medieval Europe. Tattoos became synonymous with heathenism, witchcraft, and heresy, not something you wanted associated with your name during the Inquisition. In monasteries and Christian kingdoms, tattooing virtually disappeared, reduced to whispers and superstition. But even in this era of suppression, the ink never truly dried. In the far reaches of the Byzantine Empire, some Christian sects still practiced religious tattooing, small crosses etched onto hands and arms, often to protect against Islamic enslavement. In Ethiopia, Coptic Christians maintained tattoo traditions as well, marking young believers with sacred symbols as part of spiritual rituals. And among Crusaders, the knights who marched to the Holy Land, tattoos made a quiet return. Some etched small crosses on their bodies, not just as spiritual protection, but so that, if they died in battle, they could be buried as Christians, their faith visible even in death. So while the medieval West tried to erase the art of tattooing, it never quite succeeded. The ink hid in monasteries, pilgrim trails, and desert churches, waiting patiently, like a buried relic, for its time to rise again. As the age of exploration dawned, and wooden ships began slicing through unknown oceans, tattoos found a brand new canvas: sailors. And these weren't royal court artists or tribal shamans. These were rough men, calloused by salt and superstition, who began decorating their bodies with anchors, mermaids, and crucifixes. But how did tattoos return to Europe after centuries in exile? Enter the 18th century voyages of Captain James Cook. When his crew arrived in Polynesia, they encountered entire societies marked in ink. Intrigued and amazed, many sailors got tattooed themselves, both to honour the cultures they encountered and, let's be honest, to prove they'd been somewhere exotic. Returning to port with tattoos wasn't just fashionable. It was a kind of resume, a living record of where you'd sailed and what you'd survived. Soon, tattoos became the unofficial uniform of the seafaring class. But it wasn't just about style, it was steeped in superstition. An anchor on the forearm symbolised stability. A pig and a rooster, often tattooed on the feet, were believed to prevent drowning since those animals were kept in wooden crates that floated during shipwrecks. Some sailors even tattooed "Hold Fast" across their knuckles, hoping it would give them the grip to survive rough seas and tangled ropes. And then there were the religious icons. crosses on the back, the Virgin Mary over the heart. Sailors believed these tattoos offered divine protection, an extra layer of spiritual armour when the ocean turned against them. As these inked-up sailors filtered back into European and American ports, tattoos spread with them, not to the nobility, but to the fringes. Dock workers, soldiers, convicts. Tattoos were now the language of the lower classes, the drifters and the daring. Still, they held meaning. In the US, Civil War soldiers began tattooing their names and regiments on their arms, a grim preparation in case they died in battle and needed identification, a small, painful insurance policy in a world without dog tags. So while kings and clergy shunned tattoos, the men who mapped the world wore them with pride. For them, each mark was a story, a wound, a charm, a prayer. And when the world ended in waves or cannon fire, it might be the only thing left that told your name. By the 19th and 20th centuries, tattoos had drifted far from temples and tribal rites. In many parts of the world, they had become marks of defiance, especially behind bars. Prisons gave tattoos a new language, a gritty, coded one, spoken in needles, razors, and improvised ink. Let's start in Russia. Under the iron shadow of the Soviet Union, a secret society of tattoos flourished inside the gulags. These weren't decorative. They were biographical, symbolic, ruthlessly hierarchical. A star on the shoulders? That meant you commanded respect. Barbed wire around the neck? You were a lifer, never getting out. A cathedral with domes on your chest? Each dome represented a sentence served. The tattoos told your crimes, your rank, your defiance. But break the code, or wear a symbol you hadn't earned, and you might find it carved off, forcibly, with a knife. In Japan, the Yakuza transformed the art of irizumi, once a punishment, into a badge of honor. Full-body suits of dragons, koi fish, and samurai warriors covered skin from shoulder to ankle, often hidden beneath business suits. Getting tattooed wasn't just an act of rebellion. It was a rite of loyalty, painful, expensive, and permanent. In the West, prison tattoos carried their own meanings. In American jails, a teardrop beneath the eye might signal that you've committed murder, or, in some cases, lost someone close. Cobwebs on the elbows could symbolize long sentences, dots on the knuckles, numbers, acronyms, entire identities rewritten in ink, hidden from guards but clear to anyone fluent in the language. These tattoos were often done with smuggled sewing needles, paper clips, and pens melted into ink. There was no glamour here, just pain and symbolism. For many inmates, it was less about art and more about identity. Proof that you belonged, or a warning that you didn't. Outside prison walls, these tattoos carried a heavy stigma. They marked you as dangerous, untouchable, beyond redemption. But for the men and women who wore them, the ink was often the only constant, the only part of themselves they owned in a system built to strip everything else away. Tattoos in prison weren't fashion, they were survival. By the time the 20th century hit full stride, tattoos had gone from sacred symbols and outlaw code to mainstream rebellion. If the church once saw tattoos as marks of sin, modern society started to see them as symbols of freedom, and occasionally of a very specific kind of cool. In the early 1900s, you could still catch tattooed performers in circus sideshows, tattooed ladies, and illustrated men who charged admission to show off their fully inked skin. People gasped. They stared. It was taboo wrapped in spectacle. But something began to shift around the middle of the century. Soldiers returning from World War II brought back simple tattoos. Anchors, eagles, hearts with "Mom" scrawled inside, as personal emblems of pain, patriotism, or survival. These tattoos weren't for show. They were keepsakes, burned into the skin as reminders of the things they'd seen and the brothers they'd lost. Then came the counterculture. In the 1960s and 70s, tattoos began breaking out of their blue-collar roots and onto the bodies of rock stars, bikers, and beat poets. Janis Joplin had a bracelet tattooed on her wrist. The Hells Angels wore ink like a badge of honor. The act of getting a tattoo, still a bit frowned upon by polite society, became an act of rebellion. A way to say, I don't care what you think. And tattoo parlors? They were no longer hidden dens in seedy alleyways. They started to go legit. Artists like Lyle Tuttle, who famously inked Cher and the Rolling Stones, turned the needle into a brush. Suddenly, tattoos weren't just symbols. They were statements. Personal, political, powerful. But the stigma didn't vanish overnight. Even into the 1990s and early 2000s, having visible tattoos could keep you from getting hired. No visible tattoos was printed right into many job applications. Ink still whispered of crime, deviance, or recklessness, especially for women, whose tattooed bodies were policed more harshly. And yet, the tide was turning. Tattoo TV shows emerged. Celebrities embraced full sleeves. Tattoo conventions popped up everywhere. The art form was no longer a subculture. It was culture. From rebellion to runway, tattoos had finally re-entered the mainstream. But they never forgot their roots. In a world where everything from our voices to our memories lives in the cloud, you'd think something as analog as a tattoo might be left behind. But instead, tattoos have entered a renaissance, not just surviving the digital age, but evolving with it. Today, tattoos are more than ink and skin. They're powered by apps, augmented by tech, and designed with machines that would make 19th century sailors weep. Some artists now use AI to generate hyper-detailed designs. Others work with machines that print ink with surgical precision. And then there's the rise of smart tattoos, experimental patches embedded with sensors, capable of tracking vitals, controlling devices, or even lighting up with LED ink. It's not science fiction. It's already being tested in labs. But even without the tech, tattoos are booming. What was once taboo is now celebrated across professions, genders, and cultures. Doctors have full sleeves. Teachers wear wristbands of ink. CEOs stroll into boardrooms with elaborate back pieces hidden beneath suits. Social media has democratized the art form. A tattoo in Seoul can go viral in Seattle. Artists build global audiences overnight, and customers can book a session with the tap of a phone. And yet, the meaning behind tattoos hasn't disappeared. If anything, it's become more personal. People now tattoo sound waves of loved ones' voices, coordinates of where they met their partners, portraits of pets, constellations from their child's birth night, quotes in forgotten languages, etched forever to remember, to heal, to belong. Cultural tattooing is resurging too. Indigenous communities from the Arctic to the Andes are reviving ancestral designs, reclaiming identity through skin. What was once suppressed is now proudly worn, a walking act of remembrance. Of course, debates still rage. Is it art or trend? Sacred or superficial? Can you truly own your story if it's filtered through algorithms and likes? But maybe that's the point. Tattoos have always lived in that grey area, between pain and beauty, permanence and transformation. They are both primal and futuristic, a whisper from the past and a declaration for tomorrow. And as long as humans crave meaning, memory and mark-making, tattoos will endure. Beneath the surface, ink will always speak, even when words cannot. Before empires clashed and blood soaked the sand, before kings trembled at her name, Tomyris was simply a daughter of the wind, born to the raw, open steppe. The land she came from was not gilded in marble or echoing with philosophy. It was brutal, free, and endlessly vast. This was the world of the Massagetae, fierce nomadic horse archers who rode like spirits of the plains, their lives shaped by survival, honour, and war. We know little of Tomyris's childhood, but we can imagine the rhythm of it. She would have learned to ride before she could run, to shoot before she could speak in full sentences. Among the Massagetae, Girls were not caged in tents or veiled by silence. They trained beside the boys, rode with the warriors, and grew up with iron in their blood. To lead, one had to bleed. And Tomyris, even as a young woman, bled for her people. Her tribe worshipped the sun and sky, lived off their herds, and buried their dead with weapons, ready for battle in the afterlife. They had no cities, no golden temples, but they had pride. And when enemies approached, they met them not with prayers, but with arrows. Tomyris likely came to power after the death of her husband, who may have ruled the tribe before her. But what's certain is that when the moment came, she didn't inherit leadership. She seized it. In a time when most women were considered property, Tomyris commanded an army. She negotiated with kings. She dared to speak as an equal. And if they didn't listen, she made them. She was more than a queen. She was Shahmat, the steppes' checkmate, a war chief in bronze and leather who would soon face the greatest empire on earth. But power, especially for a woman, never comes without consequence. As Tomyris began to solidify her rule, whispers grew louder. Across the mountains to the south, a king was watching. His name was Cyrus the Great, and he wanted more. The stage was set. The steppe wind howled. And Tomyris, daughter of warriors, would soon ride into legend. While Tomyris reigned over the open steppes, far to the south, a different kind of power was rising. Structured, imperial, relentless. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire, had already conquered Lydia in the west and Babylon in the south. His banners flew over deserts, mountains and cities where languages changed every few days' ride. But Cyrus wasn't done. He was a builder of empires, and every builder eventually eyes the horizon. To Cyrus, the Massagetæ were a threat wrapped in opportunity. They weren't rich in gold or cities, but they controlled the northeastern frontier, and that meant access to key lands, resources and trade routes. More importantly, the Massagetæ had something no empire could afford to ignore: pride. And pride, in Cyrus's eyes, could be bent or broken. But Cyrus also knew that brute force wasn't always the best first move. He had a reputation for cleverness, diplomacy, and strategic trickery. So he tried a different approach, one that kings before him had used to dissolve threats without a single drop of blood. He proposed marriage. According to ancient sources, notably Herodotus, Cyrus sent envoys to Tomyris offering an alliance through matrimony. On paper, it was a royal match, the great king of Persia and the warrior queen of the Massagetæ. But Tomyris wasn't naive. She saw the proposal for what it was, not an offer of love or partnership, but a calculated attempt to absorb her people without a fight. She declined, and that rejection didn't sit well in the halls of Persepolis. With the diplomatic games over, Cyrus shifted to his favourite language: war. He ordered his army to cross the Araxes River, the natural barrier that separated Persia from the land of the Massagetæ. He was going to take what Tomyris refused to give. But Tomyris was already preparing. She knew the terrain. She knew how her people fought, on horseback, fast and furious. And most of all, she knew Cyrus wasn't just coming for land. He was coming to crush a woman who dared to say no. The world's most powerful king had declared war, but he had no idea what kind of fury he had just awakened on the steppe. Cyrus the Great, master strategist and seasoned conqueror, believed he could outwit Tomyris. He had faced kings, crushed cities, and subdued nations. To him, the Massagetæ were little more than wild nomads with fast horses and no cities to defend. He didn't realize he was stepping into the path of someone just as cunning and far more furious. Tomyris had warned him. After rejecting his marriage offer, she sent a clear message: cross the Araxes River, and you will regret it. But Cyrus crossed anyway, building a bridge of boats to carry his army into Massagetæ land. Instead of striking immediately, Tomyris pulled her forces back, luring Cyrus deeper into unfamiliar terrain. The Persians found an abandoned camp, well stocked with food, and more importantly, wine, a luxury the nomadic Massagete rarely indulged in. It was a baited trap, and Cyrus took it, perhaps thinking the enemy had panicked and fled. Inside the camp, he left a portion of his army under the command of General Harpagus, a trusted officer. As the Massagete returned under the cover of night, they fell upon the drunk and unsuspecting Persians with deadly precision. The battle was brutal and swift. Among the dead was Spargapises, Tomyris' son and a Massagete commander. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say Spargapises was taken alive and, realizing his capture, begged for death and took his own life. Others claim he was killed in the fighting, but all agree. When news reached Tomyris, something inside her shattered, and then turned to steel. Her grief was volcanic, but her rage, that became legendary. She sent another message to Cyrus. This one wasn't a warning, it was a vow. "You may be a glutton for blood," she said, "but I swear I will give you your fill." She promised to make the ground run red with Persian blood, and her vengeance would not be quiet. Cyrus had taken her son. He had violated her land. Now he would meet not the queen of the Massagete, but the mother of a slain warrior, and the last face he would ever see. The next battle would not be a skirmish. It would be an execution. The sun rose over the plains like a blade, sharp and blinding. Tomyris stood at the head of her army, no longer just a queen, but a storm given form. Her warriors, hardened by the nomadic life, painted their faces with ash and rage. This wasn't about politics anymore. This was about blood. Cyrus, for all his might, had underestimated the Massagete. He assumed they would fight like the tribes he had conquered before, chaotic, uncoordinated, easy to crush. But Tomyris had spent her life among warriors. She understood how to strike. Not blindly, but with precision. She rallied her forces for a full-scale assault on the Persian invaders. And this time, she wasn't holding back. The location of the final battle is lost to history, swallowed by the vastness of the steppe. But what's clear is that Tomyris launched a ferocious counterattack. Her cavalry swept across the plains like a tide of knives. They fired arrows from horseback, closed in with axes, and fought like people with nothing left to lose. The Persians, battle-hardened, disciplined, and experienced, weren't expecting this level of organized fury. Tomyris didn't just lead her troops, she fought beside them. Her presence on the battlefield ignited her warriors like wildfire. Every strike was driven by vengeance. Every charge was an answer to her son's death. Cyrus tried to hold the line, but it shattered. The Persians were routed. Many died where they stood. Others fled into the endless grasslands, only to be hunted down. And Cyrus the Great, the man who had conquered Babylon, Lydia, and nearly the known world, fell in the chaos. Whether he was slain in combat or captured and executed depends on the version told. But either way, he died on Tomyris' terms. What came next is infamous. According to Herodotus, Tomyris found Cyrus's body on the battlefield, ordered his head severed, and then, in a final act of symbolic revenge, submerged it in a wineskin filled with human blood. "Drink your fill," she said, "of the blood you thirsted for." Was it historical fact or poetic embellishment? Maybe both. But it didn't matter. The message was eternal. Tomyris was not to be conquered. When the dust settled and the grass drank deep the blood of empire, Tomyris stood victorious. A warrior queen who had done what no king or army before her could. She brought Cyrus the Great to his end. News of the defeat sent shockwaves across the ancient world. The mighty Achaemenid Empire, thought to be unstoppable, had been humiliated by a woman from the steppes. The Persians did their best to downplay the loss, but the death of their founder couldn't be ignored. Cyrus's body was eventually returned and buried with honor in the royal tomb at Pasargadae. Yet the stain of his final defeat would linger like a wound on the empire's legacy. For Tomyris and the Massagetei, however, the victory was more than revenge. It was a declaration. They had defended their sovereignty not just with weapons, but with dignity. Tomyris had stood up to the world's most powerful ruler, and she hadn't just survived, she had triumphed. And then she vanished from history. No records survive detailing her later years, her death, or any successors she may have appointed. It's as if, after taking her vengeance, Tomyris simply rode back into the horizon and allowed the wind to carry her legend forward. In the centuries that followed, historians, poets, and chroniclers would try to fill in the blanks, turning her into a symbol as much as a woman. To the Persians, her name was a bitter reminder. To the Greeks, she was a paradox, a barbarian who displayed more nobility than many kings. And to the peoples of Central Asia, Tomyris became folklore, a ghostly queen who rides through the steppe, fierce and unbending, with a sword that remembers. Her legacy would inspire countless depictions across cultures. Medieval manuscripts portrayed her in regal armour. Renaissance paintings imagined her towering over Cyrus's corpse. In every age, she became what people needed: a mother avenger, a wild queen, a lesson in hubris, or a symbol of feminine power. But one truth cuts through the myth. She changed history. Tomyris didn't inherit a throne. She forged it in fire and fury. And for one brief, unforgettable moment, the Steppe Queen proved that not all empires rise. Some fall to the hooves of warriors who ride with vengeance in their hearts. Much of what we know about Tomyris comes not from local Massagetei records. They left no stone tablets or royal archives, but from the pen of a Greek, Herodotus, often called the father of history. Writing a century after her time, he immortalized Tomyris in his histories, casting her as a warrior queen of astonishing resolve and terrifying vengeance. But Herodotus wasn't simply reporting facts. He was weaving a story, one part chronicle, one part morality tale. To him and his Greek audience, Tomyris represented the ultimate reversal of imperial arrogance. Cyrus the Great, a man who had conquered half the known world, fell not to a vast army or a rival king, but to a woman who fought not for glory, but for her child. Her victory was almost mythic, and Herodotus treated it as such. He even detailed her grisly revenge, the wineskin of blood, the severed head of Cyrus, and her damning words, "Drink your fill." But was it true? Modern historians debate this endlessly. Some argue that Herodotus exaggerated or even invented parts of the tale, using Tomyris as a narrative tool to humble the Persian Empire, which, at the time of his writing, was still a looming force over the Greek world. Others believe that while the blood wineskin episode might be symbolic, the core event, Cyrus's death at the hands of Tomyris, likely did happen. There's also the question of bias. Herodotus, for all his insight, often filtered foreign cultures through a Greek lens. He portrayed the Massagetei as wild and free, yet noble, an exotic mirror to Greek ideals of honour and liberty. Tomyris, in that frame, wasn't just a barbarian. She was a moral counterweight to Persian ambition. Still, even if details blurred over time, Herodotus succeeded in one thing. He ensured Tomyris would not be forgotten. Because of him, she became more than a historical footnote. She entered the realm of legend, where facts soften but impact sharpens. And in that space between myth and memory, Tomyris's story found a strange kind of immortality. In a world dominated by kings and conquerors, Herodotus left us a queen who refused to kneel, and left her enemies bleeding in the sand. Though she may have slain one of the ancient world's most iconic emperors, Tomyris never ruled an empire herself. She didn't build cities of stone or inscribe edicts on golden tablets. Her people, the Massagetei, were nomads, living not by walls, but by the rhythms of the land, the sky, and the horse. This meant that Tomyris's legacy was never institutionalized. There were no marble busts or royal coins bearing her likeness, no archives to immortalize her decrees. Instead, her story passed on as stories do on the steppe, through firelight, song, and the whispered awe of warriors. The Massagetæ were one of many powerful tribes of the Central Asian steppes. Their cousins included the Scythians, the Saka, and the Dahai, all expert horse archers who roamed the lands between the Caspian Sea and the borders of ancient China. These tribes were feared by empires for their mobility, unpredictability, and ferocity in battle. Tomyris, as a female leader among them, was rare, but not entirely unique. Steppe culture, unlike many sedentary civilizations, allowed women far greater freedoms. Women rode, hunted, fought, and even led. Among the Scythians, graves of female warriors, buried with weapons, armor, and horse gear, have been found by archaeologists, confirming that the stories of fierce steppe queens were more than just legend. Tomyris stood at the pinnacle of that tradition. Her power didn't come from inheritance or religion. It came from respect, grit, and sheer capability. She was a unifying force among scattered clans, a political leader and a military commander in a landscape where survival meant riding faster, shooting better, and fearing nothing. But because the Massagetæ left no monuments, Tomyris became a kind of phantom queen, her name echoing only in the writings of outsiders and in the oral traditions of the steppe. To the Persian scribes, she was a warning. To the Greeks, a marvel. And to her people, likely a memory carried in bloodlines and battle songs, a ghost who rode with them across the plains. Empires may rise and fall in stone, but the stories of the steppe live on in the wind. And Tomyris, fierce, grieving, and unbroken, became its voice. Centuries passed, and the empires that once surrounded the Massagetæ rose and crumbled. Cyrus's successors built Persepolis, fought Alexander the Great, and faded into the dusty footnotes of time. But Tomyris? Her legend endured, not in the palaces of kings, but in the hearts of those who refused to bow. Across Central Asia, she became more than a queen. She became a symbol of female strength, of resistance, of the untamed spirit of the steppe. In many ways, Tomyris embodied a kind of defiance that transcended geography. She was not Roman, not Greek, not Persian, and so her story belonged to no empire. That made her dangerous and inspiring. In the medieval Islamic world, chroniclers occasionally mentioned her name, reshaped by language but never quite forgotten. In some versions, she was praised for her justice and vengeance. In others, she was seen as a savage queen, a reminder that power in the hands of a woman could be both glorious and terrifying. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, European artists rediscovered her tale through the writings of Herodotus. Painters depicted her in elaborate armor, standing triumphantly over Cyrus's lifeless body. In one dramatic painting, she holds his severed head aloft like a trophy, blood-soaked and victorious. It was theatrical, yes, but also political. These artists were fascinated by the idea of a woman who didn't just survive in a man's world, she won. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Tomyris became a nationalist icon in regions like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Poets and educators reclaimed her as a historical heroine, proof that the roots of Central Asian identity were fierce, proud, and deeply feminine. Her name appeared in textbooks, statues, and even military ceremonies. A woman who had once ruled on horseback with a bow in hand was now riding once more, through memory and myth, through rebellion and pride. In a world that still wrestles with the idea of powerful women, Tomyris remains a challenge. She wasn't perfect, saintly, or tame. She was decisive, brutal when necessary, compassionate only to those who deserved it. She was resistance in human form, and the blood of empire on her hands was a crown she wore without apology. History tends to favour the builders of monuments, the writers of laws, the kings who carve their names into stone. Tomyris did none of these. She left no empire behind, no palace to excavate, no royal seal to decipher. And yet, her name still lives. Not because she ruled forever, but because she refused to be erased. She stands as a contradiction to how history often remembers women, not as helpmates or footnotes, but as forces of destiny. Tomyris didn't beg for recognition. She took it with blood and fire. She didn't ride behind a king. She rode against one, and won. Her story is retold in classrooms from Central Asia to Europe, not simply because she killed Cyrus the Great, but because she dared to defy him. She wasn't defending an empire. She was defending freedom, a freedom that rode on the backs of horses, that hunted with hawks, that slept under the stars. A freedom that could not be neatly drawn on a map. Today, her statues rise from Kazakhstan's capital cities, and her face adorns coins and textbooks. To modern Central Asians, she is a mother of nations, a link to a pre-Islamic, pre-Soviet, proudly nomadic past, a reminder that their identity wasn't born in submission, but in the cry of battle and the gallop of horses. In a world still divided by power, by gender, by memory, Tomyris is a beacon, not just because she killed a great king, but because she taught us something even greater. That dignity is not given, it is seized. That sometimes leadership looks like a mother grieving her son and refusing to let the killer walk away. We often wonder why some names survive while others vanish. Tomyris survived because she was unforgettable. Because in a time when women were expected to disappear into the tents of men, she rose, blade in hand, fury in heart, and carved her story into the flesh of history. Empires fall, statues crumble, but legends ride. And somewhere, in the whispering winds of the steppe, a queen still gallops, unbroken, undefeated, and utterly unforgettable. Long before encryption keys and surveillance cameras, there was a simpler concern. How do I keep my stuff safe from nosy neighbours, wandering animals, and ambitious thieves? As human society shifted from nomadic bands to settled civilizations, possessions accumulated. And with possessions came problems, envy, theft, and the need to secure. The instinct to protect what we value is ancient, primal even. Once humans began storing food, tools, or sacred items in permanent dwellings or temples, they had to find a way to keep others out. But how do you guard something when you can't stand watch forever? The answer: invent a mechanism to do it for you. The earliest known attempt at mechanical security dates back to ancient Egypt, roughly 4,000 years ago. And what's astonishing is not just that they had locks, it's that the basic principle behind their invention still exists today. The Egyptian wooden pin lock was a marvel of early engineering. It used a wooden bolt fitted with a set of holes and wooden pegs. When the correct key, often a large wooden tool with corresponding pins, was inserted, the pegs lifted, allowing the bolt to slide open. Remove the key, and gravity dropped the pins back into place, sealing the door. This wasn't a novelty. These locks were used on storage rooms, tombs, and even temple gates. They were installed vertically, often on the inside of doors, to make tampering harder. While they may seem primitive by today's standards, the brilliance of these early systems lies in their underlying logic. They weren't merely barriers, they were puzzles. And like all good puzzles, they challenged the uninvited. What's more, these locks reveal something deeper about the people who made them. They didn't just fear theft, they anticipated it. They thought ahead. They invested time and skill in protecting things that mattered. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for an entire field of human innovation: security. So the next time you lock your front door, remember, you're not just turning a deadbolt. You're continuing a tradition started by ancient hands, driven by a timeless truth. Some things are worth guarding. The Egyptian wooden pin lock wasn't just the world's first known lock. It was also the ancestor of nearly every pin tumbler mechanism used today. Simple, elegant, and surprisingly effective, it served temples, homes, and storage rooms across ancient Egypt for centuries. And it all started with a few pieces of wood, a bit of clever design, and a deep need for privacy. Imagine a large wooden door, not one with hinges like today's, but more like a vertical plank barrier. On the inside of that door sits a wooden bolt that slides horizontally to block the entrance. But embedded within that bolt are several holes, and inside each hole rests a wooden peg. Those pegs drop into slots cut into the door frame itself, preventing the bolt from sliding open. It's locked. Now here's the magic. The key, a large wooden implement resembling a modern toothbrush, has corresponding pegs or pins that match the positions of those in the bolt. Insert the key into the bolt, and the pins inside are pushed up just enough to clear the frame slots. Once lifted, the bolt can slide open freely. Remove the key, and gravity does the rest. The pins fall back into the frame holes, relocking the door. It's mechanical memory without springs or gears, just wood, weight, and ingenuity. What made this system so impressive was its balance of complexity and reliability. It was relatively easy to craft using available materials, but hard to bypass without the correct key. And since each lock was slightly different, thanks to hand carving, keys weren't interchangeable. Your lock was your lock. These pin locks weren't reserved just for the rich or royal either. Archaeological findings at sites like Nineveh, and even later at Persian and Assyrian locations, show the concept spread widely across ancient civilizations. Egypt may have invented the idea, but the lock had legs. Beyond practical use, these locks carried symbolic power. In tombs and sacred buildings, locking something wasn't just about physical protection. It signified reverence, finality, the belief that certain things should remain untouched unless you were worthy enough to possess the key. Security in ancient Egypt wasn't just a function, it was a statement. While Egypt gave us the earliest mechanical locks, ancient Mesopotamia pioneered a very different form of security, one that relied less on mechanics and more on identity. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, security wasn't sealed with bolts and tumblers. It was pressed in clay, with symbols, authority, and trust. The people of Mesopotamia, including the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, developed a method of securing goods not by locking them, but by making unauthorized access visibly impossible. How? With cylinder seals, small carved stone rollers engraved with unique images or inscriptions. These seals were rolled over wet clay used to close containers, doors, or even official documents. Think of it as an ancient combination of a signature, a wax seal, and a barcode. Once impressed into the clay, the seal left behind a continuous pattern that could not be duplicated easily. If someone tampered with the seal, opened the container, broke the door latch, or unwrapped the tablet, it was obvious. The broken clay told on them. This approach was both simple and profound. In a world without padlocks or alarms, it focused on deterrence through visibility. The seal didn't stop you from opening something. It told the world that you had. High-ranking officials, merchants, and priests all had their own personalized cylinder seals, often passed down through generations. These seals carried such prestige that some people were even buried with them, as status symbols and tools of the afterlife. But Mesopotamian security wasn't just about clay. They also secured temple treasuries and granaries using rope bindings that could only be removed by cutting, often tied with elaborate knots or seals that would clearly show tampering. The idea was always the same: make the risk of exposure more terrifying than the reward of theft. This concept of security as accountability, of linking access to a person's identity and social status, would echo for millennia. Even today, we log in with usernames, verify with signatures, and rely on records more than locks. In Mesopotamia, to protect something wasn't just to keep it hidden, it was to publicly proclaim who had the right to touch it. As ancient Greek city-states rose in wealth and complexity, so too did their need for personal security. From treasuries in temples to coin-filled storerooms and private homes, the Greeks faced the same age-old challenge. How do you keep things safe when you can't always be there to guard them. Surprisingly, the Greeks were slower than their Egyptian and Mesopotamian neighbours in developing mechanical locks. Instead, they leaned heavily on trust, social norms, and physical barriers, sometimes reinforced by surprisingly clever, though rudimentary, devices. One such innovation was the bar and pin lock, used mostly for doors and chests. It consisted of a horizontal bar placed across a door on the inside, with a hole through which a key could be inserted from the outside to lift the bar. These keys were often large, flat iron rods, shaped like the letter F or P. They weren't the most discreet. In fact, some were almost as long as a forearm. Carrying one around made it quite obvious that you had something to protect. But Greek keys and locks weren't just functional. They also held cultural significance. Being entrusted with a key symbolized authority and responsibility. In Homer's Odyssey, Penelope is described as holding the key to Odysseus's storeroom, a symbol of her power within the household. However, Greek locks had limitations. They were often crude, easily forced, and dependent on physical size more than subtlety. What truly kept valuables secure was often a combination of concealment, guards, and communal expectations. In temples and state treasuries, rooms were sealed with rope and wax, with the city-state holding multiple keys, requiring several officials to be present to open a sacred store. Even homes were designed with layered access, multiple rooms, limited entry points, and gates that could be barred from within. Wealthy homes might employ slaves or hired guards to watch over valuables, adding a human layer of protection to the relatively simple mechanical devices. While the Greeks admired cleverness, metis, the cunning intelligence, they didn't yet channel it into lock-making the way later civilizations would. Still, they laid the cultural groundwork. Keys as symbols of status, access as a matter of trust, and security as a balance between strength and social control. If the Egyptians gave us the concept of the pin lock, and the Greeks wove trust into tradition, it was the Romans who truly elevated lock-making into a practical art. With their metallurgical skill, obsession with order, and vast bureaucracy, the Romans brought precision, portability, and innovation to ancient security. And their ideas still echo through modern locks today. Roman locks were primarily made of bronze and iron, allowing for much greater durability and smaller, more intricate designs than their wooden predecessors. They adopted the Egyptian pin-tumbler principle, but miniaturized it, refined it, and in some cases, completely reinvented it. Roman locksmiths created warded locks, which used internal obstacles, or wards, that only allowed a properly shaped key to rotate and unlock the mechanism. This meant that simply inserting any tool wouldn't work. The key had to match the internal layout. Their keys, by the way, were marvels in themselves. Made from iron or bronze, Roman keys came in all sizes, from large, staff-like keys used for city gates to finely crafted ring keys worn on the finger like jewellery. These ring keys didn't just look elegant. They served a functional purpose, offering constant access to locked boxes or cabinets without the need to carry bulky tools. It was status and utility, wrapped in metal. But the real genius came with Roman puzzle locks, complex mechanisms hidden inside ornate boxes, where pressing the wrong latch or turning the wrong angle wouldn't just fail. It might trap the lock tighter. These were used not only for securing valuables, but for hiding documents, religious relics, or even poison, a favourite trick in Roman political circles. Romans also institutionalized lock usage. Banks, granaries, merchant chests, and military storerooms all used locks. Doors had metal plates, gates had locking bars, and even slaves might be locked in with iron collars that had keys only their masters held. To the Romans, a lock wasn't just a tool, it was a statement. It declared ownership, authority, and exclusion. And it gave rise to the idea that a truly civilized society needed more than just walls to protect it. It needed systems. While the West was forging intricate metal locks, ancient China took a path that blended practicality with philosophy. Chinese engineers, ever pragmatic, developed locking systems that were simple, durable, and often symbolic, where the design of a lock didn't just protect an object, but carried deeper meaning. The most common form of ancient Chinese lock was the sliding bolt lock, a mechanism made primarily from bronze or iron. These locks typically consisted of a hollow metal case housing a sliding bolt secured by spring-loaded tumblers. Insert the right key, usually a flat, ridged metal stick, and the tumblers would align, allowing the bolt to slide and the lock to open. Sound familiar? It should. The core principle behind the modern pin tumbler lock was already alive in Han Dynasty China as early as 200 BCE. Unlike Roman locks, which often featured external keyholes and decorative flair, Chinese locks were compact, discreet, and portable. Many were used to secure chests, gates, jewellery boxes, and doors, and the emphasis was on function, not just form. But Chinese locks were more than mechanical devices. They were often cast in the shape of animals, tigers, dragons, turtles, or inscribed with symbols representing luck, protection, or wealth. A lock shaped like a fish might be placed on a money box, symbolizing abundance. A dragon lock on a door wasn't just for security. It warned intruders that a powerful force guarded what lay beyond. Locks also played ceremonial roles. During weddings, love locks were sometimes used to bind symbolic boxes or chests, representing the couple's bond. The key would be handed over as part of the marriage ritual, a gesture of trust and commitment. Some locks, particularly puzzle locks, were designed to confuse thieves. They had hidden mechanisms, false keyholes, or required a specific sequence of movements to open, not because they were necessarily harder to break, but because they bought time. In ancient times, delay could be the difference between a foiled theft and a successful one. Ultimately, Chinese security culture wasn't built around brute denial of access, but rather harmony between utility, symbolism, and clever design. In that blend of form and function, they developed a quiet legacy, one that continues in subtle locks and symbolic rituals to this day. In ancient India, security was less about brute force and more about clever concealment, symbolic barriers, and layered protection, blending spirituality with ingenuity. Indian locks weren't just meant to keep people out. They were designed to confuse, mislead, and warn, often integrating secret latches, false compartments, or symbolic inscriptions to elevate security into an almost philosophical practice. One of the standout features of Indian lockmaking was the use of deception. Puzzle locks and trick mechanisms became common in temples and treasure chests, not to prevent brute force entry entirely, but to make it complicated enough to discourage it. Some locks required multiple actions. Press one hidden button, twist a second lever, and only then would the key turn. Others had decoy keyholes that served no purpose except to trick the uninvited. Temple security especially saw intricate applications. Temples housed offerings of gold, sacred texts, and revered relics. Instead of simply hiding these behind locked doors, priests often layered security, not just physically, but ritually. A storage area might be sealed with wax, knotted rope, and a stamped clay emblem, each bearing spiritual weight. Breaking that seal wasn't just a crime, it was considered a sacrilege. Locks themselves were frequently engraved with religious imagery. Elephants, lotus flowers, deities, and protective mantras. These were not only meant to intimidate the superstitious, but also to imbue the object with symbolic armour. To touch such a lock without permission was, in many cases, an affront to the gods themselves. In Indian royal courts and merchant caravans, small portable locks were used to secure scrolls, trade boxes, and private doors. These were often crafted from iron or brass, built to be both light and durable. Key design was highly individualized, sometimes so unique that a single artisan was responsible for both the lock and its matching key, ensuring absolute security through obscurity. And like elsewhere in Asia, locks sometimes carried ceremonial roles. In marriage rituals or inheritance rites, the unlocking of a sealed chest represented not just access to material wealth, but the transfer of trust, legacy, and duty. For ancient India, the best lock didn't merely block. It puzzled, it protected, and it whispered, "Only the rightful may pass." As civilizations grew and trade routes stretched from Rome to China, the need for portable security became urgent. Whether protecting goods in a merchant's caravan or safeguarding a general's war chest, ancient locks had to do more than guard temples or doors. They had to travel. In the ancient world, trade was booming. Silk moved westward from China. Spices flowed from India. Glassware, textiles, coins, and scrolls crisscrossed continents. But with prosperity came risk. Bandits lurked on roads, dishonest porters pilfered goods, and long-distance travel meant that valuables changed hands, often without their owner present. The solution? Locks that were compact, durable, and hard to tamper with. Roman merchants often used small iron padlocks to secure chests, saddlebags, and warehouse doors. These locks had spring-loaded mechanisms and ring keys, robust enough to resist casual theft but light enough for travel. They were found from Britain to Syria, buried in ruins or rusted shut in shipwrecks. Their widespread presence speaks to a universal concern: protecting mobile wealth. Chinese traders and officials used portable sliding locks, often made of bronze, attached to chests or carts. Some were cleverly disguised, appearing ornamental or embedded within the box itself, and often featured engraved symbols or inscriptions marking ownership. If someone broke the lock, it was not only obvious. It could be prosecuted as both a crime and a dishonor. Nomadic peoples across Central Asia also developed leather and metal clasp systems, where metal rings and latches could be tied or locked over tent flaps, horse packs, and weapon cases. While these systems were less complex, they emphasized speed and visibility. A traveler would immediately know if their goods had been touched. And on the battlefield, locks were often used on weapon caches, treasury wagons, and command tents. In war, controlling access was crucial, not just to resources but to information. Scrolls and maps were sometimes sealed in locked boxes, often with multi-key systems, requiring more than one officer to open them, an early version of two-factor authorization. Across cultures, one thing remained consistent. The more mobile the world became, the more ingenious locks had to be. The road brought opportunity, but it also brought risk, and ancient travellers met it not just with swords, but with keys. When we twist a key in a door today or tap a code into a lock screen, we rarely think of the thousands of years of quiet ingenuity behind that simple motion. But every click, latch, and password is part of a story that began in the dust of Egyptian temples, in the bronze workshops of Rome, and along the silent trade routes that stitched the ancient world together. The legacy of ancient locks is not just mechanical, it's psychological. These early inventions reflect something deeply human: our desire to protect, to exclude, to define what is ours. Whether it was a wooden bolt in Thebes, a ring key in Pompeii, or a puzzle lock in Chang'an, the concept was the same: to create a boundary that only the rightful person could cross. And over time, these boundaries evolved into more than physical barriers. They became symbols. A lock on a temple door didn't just secure gold, it preserved the sacred. A seal on a scroll didn't just hide knowledge, it marked power. Even today we use locks to mark trust: a locked diary, a wedding chest, a secure vault. The mechanism may be more advanced, but the meaning is the same. In many ways, the most remarkable thing about ancient security is how little has changed. Modern pin-tumbler locks still mirror Egyptian designs. Today's privacy seals, passcodes, and even blockchain security echo ancient ideas: personal access, tamper-proofing, and symbolic control. But there's a philosophical twist, too. Ancient locks were never foolproof. They could be picked, broken, or bypassed, just like today. But their power lay not just in denying entry, but in declaring boundaries. They told the world, "This is mine. You do not have permission." And that psychological line, more than any mechanical part, is the essence of security. From tombs to trade routes, from temples to homes, locks have always been about more than theft prevention. They're about control, identity, secrecy, and sometimes survival. So the next time you slide a deadbolt or hear a safe click shut, remember, you're not just using a tool. You're continuing a story written by kings, merchants, warriors, and priests, each of them trusting a small piece of technology to hold back the world.